If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Eleanor Fitzgerald, but everyone just calls me Ellie. I'm 35 years old, and I work as a park ranger in the Shawnee National Forest in Illinois. What I'm about to tell you happened to me 5 years ago, and even now, I'm not sure if I'll ever really understand it. But I know one thing for sure, it changed my life forever. It started on a warm summer morning, the kind of day where the sunlight filters through the trees just right, making everything look golden and peaceful. I was leading a group of tourists on a nature walk through the Garden of the Gods, one of the most beautiful spots in the forest. The rock formations there are ancient, carved by time and weather into shapes that feel otherworldly. I always loved walking through those trails. It made me feel connected to something bigger than myself. The group was small that day, just a family with 2 kids and an older couple. As we walked, I pointed out different plants and talked about the history of the area. Everyone seemed happy, snapping pictures and asking questions. But then something caught my eye. At first, it was just a small pile of rocks, a cairn, stacked neatly on top of one of the formations. That wouldn't have been strange on its own, but this one was in a spot no human could have reached without climbing gear. It was balanced so perfectly that it felt wrong somehow, like it wasn't meant to be there. "Did you put that there?" one of the kids asked me, pointing at the rocks. "No," I said with a nervous laugh. Must have been some creative hiker. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something about it made my skin crawl. As we moved further along the trail, other strange things started happening. A group of deer appeared in a clearing nearby, not unusual for the area, but they weren't acting like normal deer. They stood perfectly still, watching us with unblinking eyes. Even when we got closer, they didn't move or run away like they usually would. It was like they were waiting. One of the tourists joked about them being forest security, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then there was this tree, a big oak with thick branches stretching high into the sky. As we passed it, I thought I saw something sticking out of its trunk. At first glance, it looked like human fingers growing right out of the bark. My heart skipped a beat, and I stopped walking. "Everything okay?" one of the tourists asked. "Yeah," I said quickly, shaking my head as if to clear it. When I looked again, the fingers were gone. Just smooth bark where they'd been a moment ago. I tried to brush it off as my imagination playing tricks on me, but my dog Rusty didn't seem convinced. Rusty's my best friend, a big golden retriever, who's usually fearless when it comes to exploring the forest with me. But that day, he refused to go near certain clearings, no matter how much I coaxed him with treats or encouragement. He'd just sit there growling softly, his fur bristling like he could sense something I couldn't. By the time we finished the tour, and everyone went their separate ways, I felt uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. The forest had always been my sanctuary, my escape from everything, but that day, it felt different, like it was watching me. That night, as I sat on my porch, looking out at the dark silhouette of trees against the moonlit sky, I couldn't stop thinking about those rock cairns and those deer with their unblinking eyes. Something wasn't right in Shawnee National Forest, and deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. After that strange day in the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went back to my little cabin, tucked away deep in the woods. It's a cozy place, small, quiet, and surrounded by trees. Most people would probably feel lonely living out there, but for me, it's always felt like home. The cabin is filled with books, stacked on shelves, piled on tables, even spilling onto the floor. Most of them are about folklore, myths, and legends. You see, before I became a park ranger, I was an anthropologist. I used to study stories and traditions from all over the world. But my career ended after I published a paper on what I called living folklore, the idea that some legends might be based on real, unexplained phenomena. My colleagues laughed me out of the university for it. So now, instead of classrooms and libraries, I have the forest, and honestly, I prefer it this way. Out here, the trees don't judge you. That night, as I sat at my desk flipping through one of my journals, I started writing down everything strange I'd seen that day. The rock cairns, the deer, the fingers in the tree. It wasn't the first time I'd noticed odd things in Shawnee National Forest. Over the years, I'd kept detailed notes about strange noises at night, sudden drops in temperature, and even weird patterns in how animals behaved. Most people would dismiss it as coincidence or imagination, but I knew better. Rusty lay curled up by my feet, his ears twitching every now and then like he was listening for something outside. He'd been restless all evening, pacing back and forth between the door and the windows before finally settling down. Even then, he didn't seem completely relaxed. His eyes stayed half open like he was ready to jump up at any moment. The next morning, I stepped outside to check on things around the cabin. That's when I saw it, an arrowhead sitting right on my porch steps. It wasn't just any arrowhead, it looked old, like something you'd find in a museum. The edges were chipped but sharp enough to cut if you weren't careful. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. How had it gotten there? No one ever came out this far unless they were lost or looking for me specifically. And even then, why would someone leave an artifact like this? I thought about some of the old-timers I'd talked to over the years, locals who grew up hearing stories about this forest. They'd told me about strange lights in the trees at night and whispers carried on the wind when no one else was around. Some even claimed there were ancient spirits guarding these woods, spirits that didn't take kindly to outsiders disturbing their land. At first, I told myself it was probably just a prank or maybe something left behind by a hiker who passed through without me noticing. But deep down, I felt like it was a warning. That day at work was quiet. I spent most of it patrolling trails and checking campsites for litter or damage from recent storms. Michael Oakes, one of my fellow rangers, stopped by to chat while we were both out near Devil's Backbone Trail. He's a good guy, kind-hearted, and always quick with a joke, but lately he'd been acting different too. "You look tired," he said, as we stood by our trucks after finishing our rounds. "Didn't sleep much last night," I admitted. "Yeah," he said with a nod. "Something about this place has been off lately." I wanted to ask him what he meant by that, if he'd noticed anything strange, but before I could say anything else, his radio crackled with static and an urgent call came through about some missing hunters. "Gotta go," he said quickly, before jumping into his truck and driving off. As I watched him leave, Rusty let out a low growl from where he sat in my passenger seat. "What is it?" I asked softly as if expecting him to answer. He just stared out into the trees like he could see something I couldn't. That night when I got home again, there was another artifact waiting for me on my porch, a small clay figure shaped like a person but with no face. It was crudely made but somehow unsettling to look at. I didn't know what was going on or who, or what was leaving these things for me to find, but one thing was clear, whatever it was wanted my attention, and it had it. The next few days were anything but normal. It felt like the forest was waking up, stretching its limbs, and watching me with eyes I couldn't see. 3 hunters had gone missing, and the search party wasn't having any luck. These weren't amateurs. They'd been hunting in Shawnee National Forest for years and knew the area like the back of their hands. But now, their truck was found abandoned near a trailhead, with all their gear still inside. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just an empty truck sitting there like they'd vanished into thin air. I joined the search team one afternoon, hoping to help. We combed through the woods, calling their names and checking every clearing, cave, and creek we could find. But there was nothing, no clues, no answers. The strangest part, when I talked to their families afterward, they didn't seem right. It's hard to explain, but it was like they were pretending to be worried instead of actually feeling it. Their voices sounded hollow, like they were reading lines from a script instead of speaking from their hearts. One of the wives kept saying over and over, "He'll come back." "He always does." Her smile never wavered, but her eyes looked distant, like she wasn't really there with me. That night, I went back to my cabin, feeling more unsettled than ever. I couldn't stop thinking about those hunters and their families. Something about it didn't add up. Rusty was acting strange again too, pacing back and forth near the windows and growling at shadows outside. I tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't settle. It was like he could sense something coming closer. The next morning, I decided to check some of the wildlife cameras we'd set up around the park. These cameras are motion activated and usually capture harmless things: deer grazing, raccoons rummaging through trash, maybe a coyote or two passing by at night. But what I found on one of the cameras made my stomach drop. The footage showed a group of deer walking through the forest at night, but not on all fours like normal deer. They were walking upright on their hind legs, their heads tilted at unnatural angles as they moved silently through the trees. Their movements were jerky and wrong, like puppets being controlled by invisible strings. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "This isn't possible," I whispered to myself, but it was right there in front of me. Later that day, I got a call from a local man who lived near the edge of the forest. He sounded frantic, his voice shaking, as he told me his wife wasn't his wife anymore. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. "She moves differently," he said in a whisper. "When she thinks I'm not watching, she moves wrong." I drove out to his house to check on them, but when I arrived, his wife greeted me at the door with a warm smile and invited me inside for coffee. She seemed perfectly normal, friendly, polite, but something about her felt off. Her movements were smooth and practiced, like she'd rehearsed every step before taking it, and her eyes, they never blinked, not once while we talked. The man sat quietly in the corner of the room, staring at her like she was a stranger he'd never met before. When I left their house that evening, Rusty refused to get out of the truck, even when I called him by name and offered him his favorite treat. That night, I went deeper into the forest than ever before, searching for answers. That's when I found it, a cave hidden behind thick brush that looked untouched by human hands. Inside were ancient paintings on the walls, figures wearing animal skins in what looked like rituals involving fire and blood. One painting showed a person peeling off their own skin, while others watched from a circle around them. I stepped closer to get a better look, but froze when I felt a sudden drop in temperature, like someone had opened a freezer door right behind me. Rusty barked loudly from outside the cave entrance, snapping me out of my trance. "We're leaving," I said aloud, as much for myself as for him. As we walked back toward my truck under the cover of darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone anymore, that something was following us just out of sight. And when I got home that night, there was another artifact waiting for me on my porch, a piece of semi-transparent membrane that looked like human skin but felt wrong when I touched it. I didn't know what was happening in Shawnee National Forest or why it seemed to be centered around me, but whatever it wasn't finished yet. Things started spiraling after that. It was like the forest had decided to stop hiding its secrets. Every day brought something new, something worse. The first big shock came when one of the rangers, a guy named Dave, went missing during his patrol. We all searched for him, calling his name and combing through the trails, but there was no sign of him anywhere. Then, 2 days later, he showed up at the ranger station like nothing had happened. "Where've you been?" Michael asked him, relief and frustration mixing in his voice. Dave just shrugged. "I don't know," he said flatly. "Guess I got turned around." But something about him wasn't right. His movements were stiff, almost robotic, like he was figuring out how to use his body again. And his voice, it sounded hollow, like someone trying to mimic how humans talk but not quite getting it right. Rusty wouldn't go near him. He growled low in his throat every time Dave came close, and his fur bristled like he was ready to attack. I tried to act normal around Dave, but I couldn't stop watching him out of the corner of my eye. The way he walked, the way he smiled, it all felt wrong somehow. That night, I stayed up late going through old records about the park. I found a pattern that made my blood run cold. Every 50 years, people went missing in Shawnee National Forest. Hunters, hikers, even rangers like Dave. The disappearances always happened around the same time of year, and they were never explained. I dug deeper and found newspaper articles from as far back as 1825 talking about strange sightings in the woods, figures that looked human but weren't, animals behaving oddly, and people claiming their loved ones weren't who they said they were anymore. It was all connected somehow. I could feel it. But I didn't know what it meant yet. The next day brought more bad news. The bodies of the missing hunters had been found deep in the forest near a creek. But when the coroner examined them, he found things that didn't make sense. Organs in the wrong places, bones that were hollow like bird bones, and skin that didn't look entirely human anymore. "They're not them," Michael said quietly as we stood outside the coroner's office. "What do you mean?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "I don't know how to explain it, but those bodies aren't real." I wanted to argue with him, to tell him he was being ridiculous, but deep down I knew he was right. That night, I caught Michael in the bathroom mirror shedding his skin. It wasn't like peeling off a sunburn or pulling off a bandage. It was worse than that. His reflection showed him tugging at his face until it came loose in his hands, revealing something underneath that wasn't human anymore. I froze in place, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. He didn't know I'd seen him. He just kept going like it was normal. The next day at work, I started secretly photographing people's reflections whenever I could. Rangers, tourists, even Michael himself. What I found made me sick. 5 rangers showed distortions in their mirrors, faces that didn't match their real ones, or shadows moving differently than they should have been. Rusty wouldn't go near any of them anymore. Not even Michael. That night in my cabin, I heard knocking on the trees outside, slow and steady like someone tapping out a message in Morse code. Rusty barked wildly at the sound, but wouldn't leave my side. When I finally worked up the courage to step outside with my flashlight and look around, I saw figures moving between the trees. Too fast to be human, but too big to be animals. And then I found it, the entrance to an underground chamber, hidden beneath a pile of rocks near my cabin. Inside were rows of glass-like pods filled with people, real people, including Michael himself. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. These creatures weren't just mimicking us, they were keeping us alive as reference while they perfected their disguises. They weren't done yet, but they were getting closer every day. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those pods, the real Michael, pale and unconscious, floating inside one of them. And the others, how many people had been taken? How many were walking around now, pretending to be human? I sat at my desk, staring at my notes and trying to make sense of it all. The creatures, whatever they were, weren't just killing people, they were replacing them. They were studying us, learning how to act like us, and they were getting better at it. I knew I couldn't ignore this anymore. If they perfected their mimicry, they wouldn't stop with the forest. They'd move into the towns, the cities, and no one would ever know they weren't human. I had to do something. The next morning I packed my gear, flashlights, a map, a hunting knife, and my old anthropology books. If there was one thing I'd learned from studying folklore, it was that every story had a weakness, a way to fight back. These creatures were ancient, tied to the land somehow. There had to be something they couldn't do, something they couldn't mimic. Rusty followed me as I made my way back to the underground chamber. He stayed close to my side, his ears pinned back and his tail low. He knew we were walking into danger. When we reached the entrance, I hesitated for a moment, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Then I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air was cold and damp, and the walls of the chamber seemed to hum faintly, like they were alive. The pods were still there, glowing softly in the dim light. I moved quickly, searching for Michael's pod. When I found him, I pressed my hand against the glass-like surface. His face was peaceful but pale, his chest rising and falling slowly like he was in a deep sleep. "Michael," I whispered, even though I knew he couldn't hear me. I didn't have time to figure out how to free him before I heard movement behind me, soft footsteps echoing through the chamber. I turned around slowly and saw one of them, a skinwalker, standing at the entrance. It looked human at first glance, a ranger uniform, a familiar face, but its eyes gave it away. They weren't quite right, too dark, too empty. It didn't speak, it just stared at me with those hollow eyes. I gripped my knife tightly and backed away toward Michael's pod. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. It tilted its head slightly, like it was trying to understand me. Then it smiled. a slow, unnatural smile that sent chills down my spine. I remembered what I'd read in the old legends. These creatures couldn't mimic complex emotions, things like love or grief or empathy. They could copy our faces and voices, but they couldn't feel what we felt. That gave me an idea. I took a deep breath and thought about everything that had happened. The hunters who'd gone missing, the families who weren't acting right, Michael shedding his skin in the mirror. And then I thought about what these creatures were planning to do, how many lives they'd already taken, and how many more they would take if no one stopped them. The anger hit me like a wave, hot and overwhelming, and for a moment it drowned out everything else. The fear, the doubt, even the cold air of the chamber. Is this what you want? I shouted at the creature. You want to be human? Then feel this. I let myself remember every painful moment of my life. The humiliation of losing my career after being laughed out of academia. The loneliness of living in this cabin with only Rusty for company. The guilt of not noticing sooner that something was wrong in this forest. The creature flinched slightly as if it could feel what I was feeling, or maybe it just didn't know how to process it. That's when Michael's voice echoed through the chamber. Ellie, get out. I spun around and saw him standing there. Not in the pod anymore, but behind me. For a split second, relief washed over me. But then I realized something wasn't right. It wasn't him. Not really. The real Michael was still in the pod behind me. This Michael, the one standing there, was another skinwalker. They were trying to confuse me, to make me doubt myself, but I wasn't falling for it. Rusty growled low in his throat as more of them appeared at the edges of the chamber, silent figures with familiar faces but empty eyes. I didn't have time to think. I acted on instinct. I grabbed one of the old artifacts from my bag, a small wooden carving I'd found on my porch weeks ago, and threw it at the nearest pod's control panel. The glass-like surface cracked instantly with a sharp sound that echoed through the chamber. The creatures let out an ear-piercing screech as if they could feel what was happening, and maybe they could. Michael's pod shattered completely as he fell forward into my arms, cold but alive. Run, he gasped weakly as he tried to stand on his own feet again. Together, with Rusty leading the way, we ran out of that chamber as fast as we could while everything behind us seemed to collapse in on itself. The screeches growing louder until they suddenly stopped completely. We didn't stop running until we reached my truck parked near Devil's Backbone Trail, and even then we didn't look back until we were miles away from Shawnee National Forest altogether. In the end, the Park Service covered everything up. They called it an environmental toxin, causing hallucinations among rangers and tourists alike. But I knew better, so did Michael, the real one. He didn't make it long after that night. Whatever those creatures had done to him left scars that couldn't heal. But before he passed away quietly in his sleep weeks later, he thanked me for saving him, even if only for a little while longer. Now I live alone near another forest far away from Shawnee. But sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet, I swear, I see something move just beyond where my porch light reaches. And sometimes when I touch glass, my reflection hesitates, just for a second, before matching my movements again. My name is Darius Freeman, and this happened to me 4 years ago. I was working as a ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, a place I've called home for most of my life. The forest has always been my sanctuary, a living, breathing world full of mysteries. But what I discovered that year, it changed everything I thought I knew about nature and about myself. It started like any other day. I was out in a remote section of the park, conducting soil samples near an old landslide area. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that feels clean when you breathe it in. Sunlight filtered through the canopy above, casting golden patches on the forest floor. I remember thinking how peaceful it all felt, like the forest was alive but calm, just going about its business. I crouched down to collect a sample, brushing away some leaves to get to the soil underneath. That's when I noticed something strange. The soil here was unusually rich, dark and crumbly, almost too perfect. It had minerals that shouldn't have been in this region at all. I couldn't explain it, but I figured it might just be an anomaly caused by the landslide. As I moved further along the trail, something caught my eye, a cluster of orchids blooming out of season. They were vibrant purple and white, standing out like jewels against the green moss. Orchids are rare enough in this area, but blooming at this time of year, that was unheard of. Still, I couldn't help but admire their beauty. Then I saw something that made me freeze in place. There was a tree nearby with bark that had split open slightly, revealing what looked like a human tooth embedded inside. At first, I thought it was some kind of prank or maybe an animal had carried it there, but as I leaned closer, I realized it wasn't just stuck in the bark, it was growing out of it like part of the tree itself. I stepped back quickly, my heart pounding. The forest suddenly felt different, less peaceful and more watchful, like it knew I was there and didn't want me to be. I shook off the feeling and marked the spot on my map to investigate later. But as I walked back toward my truck, I couldn't stop thinking about that tooth and how unnatural it looked growing from the bark. Something wasn't right here, but at the time, I didn't know just how wrong things were about to get. When I got back to my cabin, I tried to push the strange discovery out of my mind. My cabin was small but cozy, tucked away in the woods where I could hear the wind rustling through the trees at night. It was filled with shelves of plant specimens, jars of soil samples, and stacks of notebooks where I recorded everything I observed about the forest. This was my life, quiet, methodical, and deeply connected to the land. I wasn't always a ranger. Before this, I was a botanist specializing in soil ecology. I spent years studying how plants and soil interact, how they form these intricate systems that keep everything alive. But my career took a turn when I published a paper suggesting that plants might have some form of consciousness, a way of sensing and responding to the world beyond what we understand. Let's just say it didn't go over well in the academic community. People called me crazy, said I was imagining things. So I left that world behind and came here, where I could study nature without anyone breathing down my neck. The isolation suited me, but it came at a cost. My marriage fell apart 5 years ago. My ex-wife couldn't handle how much time I spent in the woods or how obsessed I was with my research. She wanted a life with people, with noise and activity. I wanted the quiet of the trees. We were just too different. Still, I wasn't completely alone. Amber Wilson, a graduate student working on her dissertation, had been shadowing me for a few months. She was bright and curious, always asking questions about the forest and taking notes on everything she saw. She reminded me of myself when I was younger, full of wonder, but not yet weighed down by disappointment. That evening, Amber stopped by to drop off some samples she'd collected earlier in the day. She seemed excited about something. "Darius," she said, as she handed me a jar filled with moss and tiny mushrooms. "Have you ever seen plants grow in perfect circles, like unnaturally perfect?" I looked at her, surprised. "Where did you see that?" "Near Willow Creek," she said. "It's weird, right? The plants there are growing so fast it's like they're on steroids or something." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Willow Creek was close to where I'd found that tooth embedded in the tree bark earlier. I didn't tell her about it. I didn't want to alarm her, but something about this felt connected. After Amber left, I spent hours flipping through old park records and my own journals, looking for anything that might explain what we were seeing. That's when I stumbled across something strange. Reports from decades ago about missing hikers and unusual plant growth patterns in this same area. The records described plants blooming out of season, soil changing composition overnight, and even rumors of people hearing voices coming from the trees. It all seemed too coincidental. As night fell, I tried to focus on other work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that tooth growing out of the tree bark and Amber's perfect circles of plants near Willow Creek. The forest wasn't just alive. It felt like it was trying to tell me something. I didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The next morning, the park was buzzing with news of a missing hiker. A man named Eric, mid-40s, had gone out for a solo hike 2 days earlier and hadn't returned. His family reported him missing, and the rangers were organizing a search party. I volunteered to help, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening in the forest had something to do with this. We started the search near Willow Creek, where Amber had mentioned the strange plant growth. The area was dense with trees and underbrush, making it hard to navigate. After about an hour of searching, one of the rangers called out that they'd found something. I hurried over and saw Eric's backpack lying on the ground. It looked untouched, almost like it had been carefully placed there. But that wasn't the strangest part. Around the backpack was a perfect circle of flowers, bright yellow blooms that seemed to glow in the sunlight. They were fresh and healthy, even though it was too early in the season for them to grow. The other rangers thought it was odd, but didn't dwell on it. To them, it was just a coincidence. To me, it felt like a message. As we continued searching, I noticed more signs that something wasn't right. Trees with roots that seemed to twist unnaturally toward us. Birds flying away from certain areas as if they were avoiding something dangerous. Even the air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on us. Later that day, we found another clue, a human femur half buried in the soil. It wasn't just lying there, it had roots growing through it, weaving in and out of the bone like they were feeding on it. One of the rangers gagged at the sight, but I couldn't look away. The roots were alive, pulsing slightly as if they were breathing. That night, back at my cabin, Amber came by again. She looked pale and tired. He lodged like hadn't slept. "I've been having these weird dreams," she said quietly. "I keep seeing roots growing through my body, wrapping around my bones." Her words made my skin crawl. I wanted to tell her it was just stress or her imagination playing tricks on her, but I couldn't bring myself to lie. Something was happening to both of us, to everyone who spent too much time near Willow Creek. I decided to dig deeper into the park's history. I found old records from decades ago, stories passed down by the Cherokee people who lived here long before it became a national park. They spoke of the walking roots, an ancient force that harvested human organs to feed the forest during what they called the growing season. According to their legends, this happened every 30 years when the forest awakened to reclaim what had been taken from it. The more I read, the more everything started to make sense. The missing hikers, the unnatural plant growth, even Amber's dreams. The forest wasn't just alive, it was hungry. By now, local hospitals were reporting strange cases of respiratory issues and vivid hallucinations among people who had visited the park recently. Doctors thought it might be some kind of fungal infection caused by spores in the air, but I knew better. This wasn't just nature running its course, this was something far older and far more dangerous. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was happening in this forest wasn't going to stop on its own. A few days after the search for the missing hiker, things started to spiral out of control. The forest felt different, heavier, darker, like it was closing in on us. Even the other rangers were starting to notice. Animals were behaving strangely, avoiding certain areas of the park entirely. Birds wouldn't land in some groves, and even insects seemed to vanish from patches of forest that should have been teeming with life. Then it happened. 2 rangers, Tom and Lisa, were sent to investigate reports of strange lights near Willow Creek one evening. Only Tom came back. He stumbled into the ranger station just before dawn, pale and shaking, his uniform torn and covered in dirt. His eyes were wide and unfocused, and his skin had a faint greenish tint to it. When we tried to ask him what happened, he just kept mumbling. "The roots, they're alive, they're watching." We rushed him to the hospital, but before he left, I noticed something odd. There was a sweet smell coming off him, like flowers or sap. His veins were visible under his skin, but they weren't blue. They looked green. Lisa was never found. That same day, Amber showed up at my cabin looking worse than ever. Her hands were shaking as she handed me her field journal. "Darius," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't write these." I flipped through the pages, confused. The handwriting was hers. There was no doubt about that. But the notes were strange. They described things she couldn't have known. Detailed observations about plant growth patterns that matched historical records I'd only just discovered myself. The dates didn't make sense either. Some entries were dated weeks before she even arrived at the park. Amber broke down crying. "I don't remember writing any of this," she said. It's like something's using me." I didn't know how to comfort her because deep down I was starting to feel it too. The forest creeping into my mind, into my body. I'd been having dreams of roots growing under my skin, twisting around my bones just like Amber had described earlier. And every time I woke up I felt more tired, like the forest was draining me. That night, I decided to go back to Willow Creek alone. I couldn't sit around waiting for answers anymore. I had to find out what was happening. The grove was eerily quiet when I arrived. No wind, no animals, just silence. As I moved deeper into the trees, I saw them, people walking backward through the forest in slow, jerky movements. Their heads were tilted at unnatural angles and their arms hung limp at their sides. At first, I thought they might be lost hikers or park visitors who had inhaled too many spores. But then one of them turned toward me. Its face wasn't human anymore. It was covered in bark and moss with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Its mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, its body collapsed into a pile of roots and vines that writhed on the ground before burrowing into the soil. I ran. When I got back to my cabin, Amber was gone. Her research samples were still on my desk, so I grabbed one and looked at it under my microscope. What I saw made my stomach drop. Human DNA intertwined with plant cells in a way that shouldn't have been possible. It wasn't just plants growing faster, it was something new entirely. The spores weren't just infecting people, they were transforming them. The forest wasn't just alive, it was evolving. The next day we found Amber wandering near Willow Creek with no memory of where she'd been or what had happened to her. But there was something off about her. She moved differently, slower and more deliberate, like she was listening to something we couldn't hear. That night, I realized what needed to be done. I didn't sleep that night.
Say,
How could I? The forest was changing, and I knew it wouldn't stop until it had taken everything. Amber's transformation, the missing hikers, the strange growth patterns, it all pointed to one thing. The forest wasn't just feeding, it was building something, and if I didn't stop it, there'd be no going back. I spent hours studying my notes, trying to find a weakness. That's when I remembered something from my old research. Plants rely on specific soil conditions to thrive: pH levels, mineral content, moisture. If I could disrupt the soil chemistry in the area where this thing seemed strongest, maybe I could stop it from spreading. I packed my gear and headed out before dawn. My destination was an ancient oak tree near Willow Creek, the one Amber had mentioned in her notes. It was massive, towering over everything else in the grove, its roots twisting deep into the earth like veins, but what made it stand out was the face forming in its trunk, a human face with closed eyes and a faint smile that sent chills down my spine. As I approached the oak, the air grew thick with spores. I could feel them in my lungs, making it harder to breathe. My skin tingled as if tiny roots were trying to burrow into me. I pressed forward anyway, determined not to let fear stop me. Then Amber appeared. She stepped out from behind the oak. Her movements slow and deliberate. Her eyes were different now, darker, almost hollow, but she smiled when she saw me. "It's not what you think," she said softly. "It's not evil." I froze. "Amber, what's happening to you?" She tilted her head, her smile widening. "It's evolving. The forest is trying to survive, Darius. It's creating something new, something better." Her words sent a wave of dread through me. "It's killing people," I said firmly. "That's not survival." She shook her head. "It's not killing, it's transforming. We're part of the cycle now." Before I could respond, the ground beneath me shifted. Roots burst through the soil, twisting and writhing like living snakes. They reached for me, wrapping around my legs and pulling me toward the oak. I fought back, using a machete to hack at the roots while trying to reach my backpack. Inside was a container of chemicals designed to alter soil pH, a last-ditch effort to disrupt whatever process was happening here. Amber watched me struggle, her expression calm but distant. "You don't have to fight it," she said softly. "You can be part of this. I'm not letting this happen." I growled. With one final swing of my machete, I broke free from the roots and grabbed the container from my backpack. I opened it and poured the chemicals onto the soil around the oak tree, watching as they seeped into the ground. The reaction was immediate. The roots recoiled violently, thrashing like wounded animals before retreating into the earth. The face on the oak twisted in agony, its features contorting as cracks spread across its bark. Amber screamed, a sound that was both human and something else entirely, as vines erupted from her arms and legs. "I'm sorry," she whispered before collapsing into a pile of roots and moss. The grove began to collapse around me as plants withered and died in rapid succession. The spores in the air dissipated, and for the first time in days I could breathe freely again. But it wasn't over. As I made my way out of Willow Creek, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a victory. It was only a delay. The forest had been weakened but not destroyed. Whatever force had created this cycle would return eventually. Back at my cabin, I tried to move on with my life, but things were never the same after that day. Every time I looked at my hands or felt an itch on my skin, I wondered if something had taken root inside me. A few weeks later, while examining some soil samples from Willow Creek, I noticed something strange, a tiny sprout growing from my forearm. It wasn't painful or invasive. It felt natural. I carefully pruned it and placed it in a specimen jar on my desk, and then I waited. My name is William Nakamura, but most people just call me Bill. I've been a park ranger at Glacier National Park in Montana for over 25 years. This place has been my home, my refuge, and sometimes even my escape. But what happened to me here a few years ago? Well, it changed everything. It's something I'll never forget, no matter how hard I try. It all started during late October. Just as the first snowfall of the season began to blanket the mountains, the air was crisp and the forest smelled clean and fresh, like it always does before winter really settles in. I was out doing routine maintenance on one of the remote weather stations deep in the park. It's a quiet job most of the time, just me, my tools, and the sound of the wind brushing through the trees. That day felt different though. The frost patterns on the rocks caught my attention right away. They weren't random like they usually are. They were perfect geometric shapes, circles, triangles, even spirals. I'd never seen anything like it before. At first, I thought it was just nature showing off one of its tricks, but looking back now, I should have known better. On my way back to my cabin, I ran into a hiker who had wandered off the trail. He looked cold and scared, so I helped him find his way back to safety. I remember warning him about an approaching cold front that was supposed to hit later that night. The forecast said it would be colder than usual for this time of year, nothing too strange for Montana, but still worth keeping an eye on. When I got back to my cabin, everything seemed normal enough. It's a modest little place tucked away in the woods, filled with memories of my late wife Alice. She passed away 2 years ago from cancer, and since then, this cabin has been my sanctuary. Her watercolor paintings of the park hang on every wall. Mountains, rivers, sunsets, all reminders of her love for this land. As the evening rolled in, I stepped outside to admire the snowfall under the moonlight. That's when I noticed something strange near the edge of my property, a fox frozen solid in a block of clear ice. The weird part wasn't just that it was frozen, it was warm enough that day for ice to melt easily. But this ice didn't melt at all. It stayed perfectly intact no matter how long I stared at it. When sunlight hit the ice the next morning, something even stranger happened. Symbols formed on its surface, symbols that looked eerily similar to those frost patterns I'd seen earlier on the rocks. At this point, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unnatural was happening. I tried not to think too much about it as I went about my day. After all, nature has its mysteries, and part of my job is accepting them without question. But deep down, I felt like this wasn't just another mystery. It was something bigger. I've always believed that the wilderness has a way of healing people. It's quiet, predictable, and honest in a way the rest of the world isn't. After Alice passed, I threw myself into my work as a ranger. I figured if I couldn't fix what had happened to her, Maybe I could at least take care of this land we both loved so much. My days were simple. I'd wake up early, make coffee, and spend hours hiking trails, checking weather stations, or logging wildlife activity in my journal. That journal was like my second brain. I'd been keeping it for decades, recording everything from snowfall patterns to bear sightings. Some people might call it boring, but for me, it was comforting. The cabin I lived in was small but cozy. It had a wood stove for heat and shelves lined with Alice's books and paintings. Her favorite was one she did of the northern lights over Lake McDonald. It hung right above the fireplace. Every night before bed, I'd sit by the fire and look at that painting, thinking about her. There weren't many people in my life anymore. Most of my family lived far away, and I wasn't much for socializing. The only person I really talked to was Jesse Thompson, a young ranger I'd been mentoring for the past year. Jesse reminded me a lot of Alice, kind-hearted, curious about everything, and always asking questions about the park's history. She had this energy about her that made me feel like maybe I wasn't so alone after all. But even Jesse couldn't distract me from what had been happening lately. The strange frost patterns, the frozen fox, they kept nagging at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. And then there was the cold front that had rolled in faster than any storm I'd ever seen before. That morning, when I checked the thermometer outside my cabin, it showed a temperature drop of 60 degrees overnight. 60 degrees. That kind of thing just doesn't happen, not here, not anywhere. And it wasn't just the cold that was unusual. The air felt heavier somehow, like it was pressing down on everything around me. The radio wasn't much help either. Every time I tried to call in to the main station, all I got was static, or worse, this weird crackling sound like ice breaking underfoot. When I checked the microphone on my radio equipment, it was covered in tiny ice crystals that shouldn't have been there. Later that day, I got word from another ranger about two backpackers who'd been found frozen solid up near Logan Pass. They were experienced hikers with all the right gear. There was no reason they should have been caught off guard by the cold. But when they were brought back for an autopsy, well, let's just say things got even stranger. The coroner said their bodies hadn't just frozen, they'd turned to ice from the inside out. Their blood vessels were filled with ice crystals, as if something had frozen them alive from within. No one could explain it. That night, as I sat by the fire staring at Alice's painting, I felt a chill run down my spine, not from the cold outside, but from something deeper. Something told me this wasn't just a freak weather event or some strange coincidence. I couldn't help but think back to stories my grandfather used to tell me when I was a kid. Stories about ice spirits that roamed these mountains during harsh winters. He said they were ancient beings tied to the glaciers themselves, protecting them from harm or punishing those who disrespected them. At the time, I thought they were just old folk tales meant to scare kids into behaving. But now I wasn't so sure. The next few days were unlike anything I'd ever experienced in my years as a park ranger. The cold wasn't just cold, it was unnatural. It felt alive, like it was creeping into every corner of the park, watching us. One morning, I woke up to find the windows of my cabin completely frosted over from the inside. The frost wasn't random either. It had formed patterns just like the ones I'd seen on the rocks and the ice around the Fox. Perfect circles, spirals, and shapes that looked almost like writing. It gave me chills, and not just because of the temperature. When I stepped outside, the world was silent. Too silent. Normally, even in winter, you'd hear birds or the rustling of trees in the wind. But now there was nothing, no sound at all. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath. That same day, I got a call from Jessie on the radio. Her voice sounded shaky as she told me about something she'd seen near one of the trails. She said there were strange blue lights moving across one of the glacial fields at night, slowly, like they were searching for something. At first, I thought she might have been imagining things, but then she mentioned something else. Animals were leaving the area in droves. Deer, elk, even bears. They were all heading down to lower elevations, away from the cold. Animals don't do that unless they sense danger. Later that afternoon, I got word about another discovery up near one of the glaciers. A group of researchers had found human remains emerging from the ice, ancient remains that had been buried for centuries. But here's where it gets weird. Parts of the body had turned into ice crystals. Not frozen flesh, actual crystals that sparkled in the sunlight like glass. The researchers couldn't explain it, and honestly, neither could I. That night, I had a dream, or at least I think it was a dream. In it, I was walking through a frozen forest under a pale blue sky. The trees were covered in thick layers of ice that sparkled like diamonds. Everything was beautiful but eerily quiet. As I walked deeper into the forest, I saw a lake ahead of me. Its surface was perfectly smooth and clear like a mirror. I felt drawn to it like something or someone was calling me. But just as I reached the edge of the lake, I woke up in a cold sweat. My hands were trembling, and my breath came out in short gasps. The fire in my cabin had gone out during the night, and when I looked around, I saw frost creeping along the walls and floorboards. It wasn't just inside my cabin either. The frost seemed to be spreading everywhere throughout the park. The next day brought more bad news. 2 more hikers had been found frozen solid on one of the trails leading up to Logan Pass, the same area where those backpackers had been found earlier. Their bodies were discovered standing upright in poses of terror, their faces frozen mid-scream. I went out to investigate with Jesse and another ranger named Mike. When we reached the site where they'd been found, we saw something that made my stomach drop. Ice sculptures scattered across the trail, perfectly detailed figures of people frozen in lifelike poses. At first glance, they looked like statues carved by an artist. But as we got closer, we realized they weren't statues at all. They were hollow shells made entirely of ice. There was no sign of how they'd formed or who or what had made them. That night, back at my cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I glanced out the window into the dark forest beyond my porch, I thought I saw movement, shadows shifting between the trees or faint blue lights flickering in the distance. And then there was Jessie. She'd gone out alone earlier that evening to investigate some strange ice formations near one of our weather stations but hadn't returned until hours later. When she finally showed up at my cabin just before midnight, she looked different. Her skin had a faint bluish tint to it, almost like frostbite, but she didn't seem cold at all. And when she spoke to me, her voice sounded distant and hollow, like an echo bouncing off ice walls. "Are you okay?" I asked her. She nodded but didn't say much else before heading back to her own cabin for the night. I couldn't sleep after that, not with everything that had happened and not with Jessie acting so strange. Something was happening out here in Glacier National Park, something none of us understood, and I had a sinking feeling it was only going to get worse. The storm hit hard the next day. A blizzard rolled in, cutting off all access roads and trapping the few of us left in the park. There were 5 rangers, including me, and 3 visitors who had been staying at one of the lodges. We gathered at the main station to figure out what to do, but the snow was coming down so fast that even stepping outside felt like walking into a wall of ice. The radio was still useless, just static and that strange crackling sound. We were completely cut off from the outside world. Jessie was acting stranger by the hour. She kept wandering off on her own, staring at the frost-covered windows like she was listening to something none of us could hear. When I asked her where she'd been during those 6 hours she went missing, she just shrugged and said, "I don't remember." Her skin was even more blue now, and when she breathed, there was no condensation, no fog from her breath like you'd expect in freezing temperatures. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, shaking the walls of the station. But it wasn't just the storm keeping me awake. It was Jessie. Around midnight, I heard her moving through the building, her footsteps light but deliberate. I followed her quietly, not wanting to scare her or alert anyone else. She walked out into the snow without a jacket or gloves, like she didn't feel the cold at all. I watched from the doorway as she stood in the middle of the parking lot, staring up at the sky. Her body began to shimmer under the moonlight, her skin turning translucent like ice. I froze in place as I saw her change right before my eyes. Her hair crystallized into delicate strands of frost, and her hands became sharp and jagged like icicles. She wasn't Jessie anymore. Not entirely. She was something else now, something cold and unrecognizable. And then she turned to look at me. Her eyes were glowing faintly blue, and when she spoke, her voice sounded like wind rushing through a frozen canyon. "It's here," she said. "It's awake." I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Jessie didn't follow me. She just stood there in the snow, watching as I retreated back inside. The next morning, we found two of our rangers dead near one of the trails leading out of the park. They'd tried to hike out for help, but hadn't made it far before freezing solid. Their bodies were posed like statues, one reaching out for something while the other curled up on the ground as if trying to shield himself from the cold. But it wasn't just them. Perfect ice sculptures had appeared all over the park overnight, figures of people and animals frozen in lifelike poses. Some looked terrified, others looked peaceful, almost serene, but all of them were hollow inside, empty shells made entirely of ice. That's when I realized what we were dealing with wasn't just a freak storm or some strange weather phenomenon. It was something ancient and alive, something tied to the glaciers themselves. I started piecing together everything I'd seen, the frost patterns, the frozen fox, Jessie's transformation, and remembered what my grandfather had told me about those ice spirits. He'd said they were protectors of the land, but also dangerous if disturbed or threatened. Global warming had been melting Glacier National Park's ice for years now, releasing things that had been buried for centuries. Whatever this thing was, the Rime Walker, it had been trapped in that ancient ice until now. And it wasn't just protecting itself, it was trying to preserve everything around it by turning it into ice. By that evening, Jessie had disappeared completely. One of our visitors, a young man named Eric, claimed he saw her walking toward an ice cave near one of our research stations before vanishing into thin air. I knew what I had to do. The storm showed no signs of stopping, but I grabbed my gear and headed toward that ice cave alone. Inside, I found something that made my blood run cold, a massive block of ancient glacier ice glowing faintly blue from within. Embedded in its surface were human remains, Native American bones frozen alongside more recent victims from decades past. The ice seemed alive somehow. It pulsed faintly like a heartbeat, and when I touched it, images flashed through my mind. People walking into freezing lakes, animals encased in crystal cocoons, Jessie standing motionless as frost overtook her body. And then I saw Alice. Her face appeared within the ice, a perfect likeness frozen in time, and for a moment I thought I heard her voice calling my name. Tears streamed down my face as I realized she was part of this thing now, a collective consciousness made up of everyone who'd ever frozen to death in these mountains. The Rime Walker wasn't evil, not exactly, but it didn't understand life or death the way we do. To it, freezing people wasn't killing them, it was preserving them forever. I knew there was no way to destroy it completely, not with something this ancient and powerful, but maybe I could negotiate with it. The ice cave was colder than anything I'd ever felt before. Every breath I took burned my lungs, and frost clung to my eyelashes and beard. The glowing ice in front of me pulsed faintly, like it was alive. I could feel it watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I stared at the frozen faces embedded in the ice, men, women, even children, and I couldn't stop my eyes from landing on Alice. Her face was so peaceful, like she was asleep. Seeing her there broke something inside me, but it also gave me strength. I pulled out the thermal charges I'd brought with me, the ones we usually used for avalanche control. My plan was simple. If I couldn't destroy this thing completely, maybe I could weaken it enough to stop it from spreading further. As I set the charges around the ice block, I felt the temperature drop even lower. The frost on the walls began to spread faster, creeping toward me like it was alive. The Rime Walker didn't want me to leave. It wanted me to stay, to become part of it. And then I heard its voice. It wasn't a voice like you or I would use. It spoke through the ice itself, forming shapes and patterns that somehow made sense in my mind. It told me what it was, a collective consciousness made up of everyone who had ever frozen to death in these mountains. It wasn't trying to kill. It was trying to preserve what it thought was beautiful and sacred. "You can join us," the voice said, echoing through my head like a whisper carried on the wind. "You can be with her again." For a moment, I hesitated. The idea of being with Alice again, of seeing her smile and hearing her laugh, was almost too tempting to resist. But then I remembered Jesse and Mike and all the others who had already been lost to this thing. If I didn't stop it now, more people would die. "I'm sorry," I said quietly, looking at Alice's frozen face one last time. "I can't." I hit the detonator. The explosion shook the cave, sending shards of ice flying everywhere. The glowing block cracked and splintered, releasing a blast of freezing air that knocked me off my feet. For a moment, I thought I'd done it, that I'd stopped the Rime Walker for good, but then the cold came rushing back. The ice began reforming almost instantly, pulling itself back together piece by piece. The glowing blue light returned, brighter than before, and I realized destroying it wasn't possible, not completely. That's when I remembered what my grandfather had told me about sacred boundaries in nature, places where spirits could be contained if treated with respect. Using everything I knew about Glacier National Park's terrain and history, I started marking boundaries around the cave with spray paint from my pack. "I'll make you a deal," I said aloud, hoping the Rime Walker could hear me. "You stay here inside these boundaries, and no one will disturb you again." The frost stopped spreading as if it were listening. "I'll make sure this land is protected," I continued. "No more melting glaciers, no more destruction, but you have to promise not to hurt anyone else." The ice pulsed faintly in response, and for a moment everything went still. 3 people died that night, Jesse included. But somehow I survived. My hands were badly frostbitten from the cold. I ended up losing several fingers. As a result, the Park Service dismissed everything that happened as hallucinations caused by extreme weather and isolation, but I knew better. The Rime Walker stayed within the boundaries we'd agreed on, at least for now, and every year since then, I've returned to perform a ritual at those sacred sites to keep our pact intact. Years later, as an old man nearing retirement, I found myself standing at one of those sites with a young ranger who reminded me of Jesse, a bright-eyed kid eager to learn everything about Glacier National Park. "Always pay attention to the frost," I told him as we stood near one of the marked boundaries. "If you see patterns that don't make sense, shapes or symbols, it means something's waking up." He nodded seriously but didn't ask any questions. Maybe he thought it was just another tall tale from an old ranger who'd seen too much during his time in the wilderness. But as we walked away from that site together, I glanced back at the frost-covered rocks one last time and saw a faint blue light flickering in the distance. It wasn't over, not entirely, but for now, things were quiet. My name is Malcolm Hayes, and this happened to me back in the spring of 1962. I was the head ranger at Blackwater National Forest in Montana, a place I'd called home for almost 10 years. People say the forest is peaceful, but they don't know it like I do. It has secrets, dark ones, and I learned that the hard way. It started like any other day. The sun was rising over the eastern ridge, painting the trees with warm golden light. I was out on patrol, riding my horse, Duke. He's a good horse, steady and reliable, but that morning he seemed nervous. His ears kept twitching, and he snorted every few steps as we got closer to Whispering Canyon. I didn't think much of it at first. Animals can be skittish for all sorts of reasons. The forest was alive with the sounds of spring, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, and the soft babble of a stream nearby. I spotted a family of deer drinking from the water, their heads bobbing up and down as they took turns sipping. It was one of those moments that reminded me why I loved this job. Out here, everything felt right. I pulled out my journal to jot down some notes, temperature readings, wildlife sightings, things like that. It's part of my routine, something that keeps me grounded. But just as I was about to close my notebook, Duke froze in his tracks. His muscles tensed, and he let out a low whinny. That's when I saw it, a fox lying on the ground near the stream. It wasn't just dead, it looked wrong. Its body was untouched, no bite marks or signs of struggle, but its throat had been cut cleanly, and its vocal cords gone, removed with surgical precision. I dismounted and crouched down to get a closer look. My stomach turned as I realized how unnatural it was. No predator does this. Not wolves, not bears, not anything I've ever seen in these woods. The air around me felt heavier all of a sudden, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Duke refused to go any closer, so I had to drag him back toward the trail. As we left Whispering Canyon behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something hidden among the trees. That was just the beginning. After that strange discovery, I made my way back to the ranger station. It's a small building tucked away in the middle of the forest. Nothing fancy, just a place for us rangers to regroup and handle paperwork. I couldn't stop thinking about the fox. Something about it gnawed at me, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was just some twisted poacher passing through. At the station, I met up with Paul Winters, our youngest ranger. Paul's only 26, fresh out of college and eager to prove himself. He's got this energy about him, like he's always trying to impress me. "Hey Malcolm," he said with a grin. "Find anything interesting out there today?" I hesitated for a moment. "Just the usual," I replied, not wanting to worry him yet. Paul's a good kid, but he's not ready for the darker side of this job. Loretta Jenkins was sitting at her desk by the radio when I walked in. She's been our operator for years, a motherly type who always has a kind word for everyone. She looked up from her paperwork and gave me that knowing look she always does. "You've got that face again," she said softly. "What face?" I asked. "The one you get when something's bothering you." I didn't answer her right away. Loretta knows me better than most people do. She knows about my time in Korea, about the things I saw over there that still haunt me. She doesn't push me to talk about it, but sometimes she can tell when those memories are creeping back in. Later that night, I sat alone in my cabin. It's a simple place, one room with a bed, a stove, and a small table where I keep my journal. The only personal item I have is a bullet casing from my last kill in the war. It's not something I'm proud of, it's just there. A reminder of who I used to be. I tried to sleep, but the nightmares came again. They always do. Flashes of gunfire and faces of men I couldn't save, and the sound of whispers, soft voices calling my name from somewhere far away. When I woke up, those whispers didn't stop. They were faint but unmistakable, coming from just outside my cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Nothing, just the wind rustling through the leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. But as I turned back toward the cabin, I noticed something strange, a series of pictographs carved into a tree near my porch. They weren't there yesterday. The carvings looked old, Native American symbols that seemed to tell some kind of story. One showed what looked like a man surrounded by tall shadows, another showed an open rib cage with something inside it. My pulse quickened as I traced my fingers over the rough bark. I didn't know what they meant, but deep down I felt like they were some kind of warning. The next few days were strange, to say the least. It felt like the forest was changing, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I've worked these woods for years, and I know them better than anyone. But suddenly, they didn't feel familiar anymore. They felt wrong. It started with a group of hikers who came into the station one morning. They looked shaken, pale, like they'd seen a ghost. We heard someone calling our names. One of them said, her voice trembling, from deep in the woods. But there was no one there. Paul tried to reassure them. "Probably just the wind," he said with a smile. "Or maybe another hiker playing tricks." But I wasn't so sure. Later that day, I went out to investigate their claims. As I walked through the forest, I noticed something odd, footprints in the dirt that didn't make sense. They were human-shaped, but had 6 toes, and they didn't lead anywhere. They just circled around and around, like whoever made them had been pacing in one spot. At sunset, something even stranger happened. The forest went completely silent. Not just quiet, but dead silent. No birds chirping, no leaves rustling. Not even the sound of my own footsteps seemed right. It lasted exactly 7 minutes before everything returned to normal. The animals were acting weird too. deer abandoning their usual grazing spots, birds migrating months earlier than they should have. Even Duke was on edge, refusing to go near certain parts of the trail. One night, while I was listening to the ranger radio in my cabin, I heard something that made my blood run cold. My own voice coming through the speakers. I hadn't used the radio all day, but there it was, clear as day, saying things I'd never said. "Help me," my voice whispered through the static. I froze, staring at the radio like it might come alive. Then it went silent again. The next morning, I found something that pushed me over the edge, a tree bleeding sap in a pattern that looked exactly like a human circulatory system. The veins and arteries were perfect, like someone had drawn them with surgical precision. And then there were the coyotes. A pack of them had been found dead near Whispering Canyon, all of them with their vocal cords removed, just like the fox I'd found earlier. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was happening in Blackwater Forest, something unnatural, and it wasn't going away. Things took a turn for the worse after that. Whatever was happening in the forest wasn't just strange anymore. It was dangerous, and it was getting closer. It started with Paul. He'd gone out to check on Whispering Canyon after hearing some strange noises on the radio. I told him to wait for backup, but he waved me off, all eager to prove himself. "I'll be fine, Malcolm," he said with that cocky grin of his. "It's probably just a bear or something." But Paul didn't come back. We sent out a search party the next morning. Me, Loretta, and Timothy, our seasonal ranger who was studying biology at the university. Timothy was a bright kid, full of curiosity, but I could tell he was scared. We all were. We found Paul's gear near the canyon, arranged in a perfect circle. His backpack, flashlight, and even his boots were laid out like someone had placed them there on purpose. In the middle of the circle was his voice recorder, still running. I picked it up and pressed play. At first it just sounded like Paul talking to himself, describing what he saw and heard. But then his voice started to change. It became distorted, like he was speaking underwater, and then it multiplied. I heard his voice coming from every direction at once, overlapping and echoing until it didn't sound human anymore. That's when we saw it. A shadow moved between the trees, tall and impossibly thin, with long limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in ways they shouldn't. It was fast, too fast for us to get a clear look. But I knew it wasn't an animal. It wasn't anything natural. We ran back to the station as fast as we could. None of us spoke a word about what we'd seen, not yet, but we all knew something was out there. That night, an elder from the local Blackfoot tribe came to see me. His name was Joseph Two Feathers, and he'd lived near Blackwater Forest his entire life. He told me stories about a creature called the Thief of Voices, something that woke up every 60 years to hunt in these woods. "It mimics what it hears," Joseph said in a low voice. "Your voice, your memories, even your fears. It takes them and uses them against you." I wanted to dismiss it as just another legend, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. The next day, we found Paul's body, or what was left of it, near Whispering Canyon. His throat had been transformed into something inhuman. It looked like a second mouth had grown, where his vocal cords used to be. And then we heard it, Paul's voice calling for help from deep in the woods. But it wasn't Paul anymore. The creature had learned his voice, and worse, it knew our ranger protocols now. It started using them against us, calling out fake distress signals to lure us into traps. Timothy fell for one of them. He thought he heard me calling him over the radio and went off on his own to investigate. By the time we realized he was missing, it was too late. We found him hours later, dead, with his throat mutilated just like Paul's. The creature wasn't just hunting us, it was playing with us. After Timothy's death, the station felt like a ghost town. Loretta and I were the only ones left, and neither of us could sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, it all felt like it could be asterisk, the creature, the echo stalker. I spent hours going through my journal, trying to piece together what I knew. It wasn't much. The creature mimicked voices to lure its prey. It seemed drawn to sound, complex sounds like human voices, especially ones filled with emotion, and it was fast, too fast to track in the open. but there had to be a way to stop it. That night, I heard Loretta scream. I grabbed my rifle and ran to her cabin, heart pounding in my chest. When I got there, the door was wide open, and the room was empty. But her voice was everywhere. "Malcolm, help me." It came from the woods, from the radio on her desk, even from behind me. It was like the forest itself was mocking me. I knew it wasn't really her. I knew it was a trap, but I couldn't just leave her out there, not if there was even a chance she was still alive. I followed the sound into the woods, keeping my flashlight low and my rifle ready. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for spring, and every step felt heavier than the last. The forest was so quiet that I could hear my own breathing, shaky and uneven. Then I found it, the cave. It was hidden behind a cluster of rocks near Whispering Canyon, a place I'd never noticed before despite all my years patrolling these woods. Inside, the air smelled like rot and damp earth. My flashlight flickered as I stepped deeper into the darkness. That's when I saw them. Dozens of vocal cords, human, animal, maybe even older than that, were strung up along the walls like some kind of grotesque art gallery. They pulsed faintly, as if they were still alive, and each one seemed to hum with a faint sound, a voice trapped inside it. And in the center of the cave stood Asterisk. Asterisk. The Echo Stalker was even worse, up close, gaunt and pale, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its rib cage opened like a grotesque flower, revealing a second mouth lined with jagged teeth. It didn't move at first, it just stood there, tilting its head as if studying me. Then it spoke in Loretta's voice. "Malcolm," it said softly, "you can't save them." I raised my rifle and fired without hesitation. The shot echoed through the cave, but the creature barely flinched. Instead, it let out a deafening screech that made my ears ring and my vision blur. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head as its voice filled my mind, dozens of voices all at once, overlapping and screaming. But then I remembered something Joseph had said, Asterisk. The creature is drawn to sound. Asterisk. I reached into my pack and pulled out a white phosphorus grenade, a leftover from my time in Korea that I kept for emergencies. My hands were shaking as I pulled the pin and rolled it toward the creature. The explosion lit up the cave like daylight, filling it with fire and smoke. The Echo Stalker let out an ear-piercing wail as its rib cage snapped shut and its body twisted in agony. When the smoke cleared, it was gone, but not dead. I could feel it retreating deeper into the forest, weakened but still alive. I stumbled out of the cave just as dawn broke over the horizon. My throat felt raw, like I'd been screaming for hours, but no sound came out when I tried to speak. When I got back to the station, Loretta was waiting for me on the porch. She looked shaken but alive. Thank God for that. But when she tried to talk to me, I couldn't respond. My voice, it was gone. The doctors couldn't explain it later on. My vocal cords were intact, but no sound would come out no matter how hard I tried. It was like something had stolen them in that cave. Now, months later, I've retired from being a ranger and moved far away from Blackwater Forest. But sometimes at night, when everything is quiet, I hear whispers coming from nowhere in particular. And sometimes, they sound like me. My name is Robert Jenkins, but everyone calls me Bobby. This happened to me back in 1958, and even now, I still think about it every day. I've spent my whole life in the Everglades, guiding people through its winding waterways and dense mangroves. After the war, I became a park ranger, dedicating myself to protecting this wild and beautiful place. I thought I knew every inch of it, every island, every bird call, every ripple in the water. But what I saw that year changed everything. It started on a quiet morning. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges. I was out on patrol with Vincent Powell, a new ranger trainee who'd only been working here for a few weeks. He was a city boy, wide-eyed and eager to learn, but you could tell he wasn't used to the swamp yet. The bugs, the heat, the endless mist that seemed to hang over everything like a blanket. We were riding in my airboat, cutting through the misty channels that snaked through the park. The hum of the engine was the only sound besides the occasional splash of water or distant bird calls. I pointed out some rare birds, a roseate spoonbill perched on a low branch, and Vincent scribbled notes in his little notebook like his life depended on it. "Look at that mist," Vincent said suddenly, his voice breaking my train of thought. I glanced up and frowned. The mist wasn't lying low over the water like it usually did. Instead, it was rising in strange vertical columns, almost like ghostly towers stretching toward the sky. It wasn't natural. I'd never seen anything like it before. As we slowed the boat down to take a closer look, something caught my eye in the water ahead. The surface was perfectly still, like glass, but there was something off about it. The reflection didn't match the sky above. It showed swirling blue lights instead of pink and orange clouds. "Do you see that?" I asked Vincent, pointing at the water. He nodded nervously, but didn't say anything. His hand tightened around his notebook as he leaned forward for a better look. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine and told myself it was just some trick of light or weather, a weird phenomenon that would pass as quickly as it had appeared. But deep down, I knew better. The Everglades had always been full of mysteries, and this felt like one of them. As we continued deeper into the park, more strange things started happening. Blue lights flickered at the edges of my vision, always there but never quite visible when I turned my head to look directly at them. The water rippled in perfect circles with no apparent source, as if something invisible had disturbed it. At one point, we passed an ancient cypress tree that seemed different somehow. Its bark looked like it had faces forming in it whenever the mist touched it. Vincent noticed it too and snapped a picture with his camera before asking me about it. "Some folks say these trees are haunted," I told him with a shrug. "Others think they're just playing tricks on us when we're tired or distracted." Vincent laughed nervously, but didn't press further. He didn't want to admit how unsettled he was. I could see it in his eyes, but I couldn't blame him. Something about that morning felt wrong. As we made our way back toward the ranger station, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there in the misty channels, that something was watching us from just out of sight. I've lived in the Everglades long enough to know its moods. It can be peaceful one moment, wild the next. That's what I love about it. It's alive in a way most people don't understand. But that morning with Vincent, something about the swamp felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My home is a stilt house on a little island tucked far away from the main park. It's quiet out there, just the way I like it. The only sounds are the wind rustling through the mangroves and the occasional splash of an alligator slipping into the water. Inside, I've got shelves lined with old artifacts, arrowheads, carvings, things passed down from my Seminole friends over the years. They've taught me a lot about this land, about its history and its secrets. I spend most of my time out on patrol or working on conservation projects. When I'm not doing that, I'm logging everything: the water levels, fish migrations, bird sightings. I've been doing it for decades. It's not just a habit, it's my way of keeping track of how this place is changing, and lately, those changes have been coming faster than ever. Developers are always trying to push in, drain the wetlands, build roads, put up resorts. It makes me sick to think about what they're doing to this place. The Everglades are delicate. Every piece depends on every other piece to survive. Mess with one part, and the whole thing starts to fall apart. Maybe that's why I've been having those dreams lately. In them, I'm walking underwater, but I can breathe just fine. The sunlight filters down through the surface above me, and everything is calm and quiet. But there's always something just out of sight, something watching me from the shadows. I try not to think too much about those dreams or what they mean, but after that morning with Vincent, the mist columns, the strange lights, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were connected somehow. That night, as I sat on my porch listening to the frogs and crickets, I found myself staring out at the water longer than usual. The mist was thicker than normal, curling around the trees like it had a mind of its own. For a moment, I thought I saw one of those blue lights flicker in the distance. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild after a long day. But deep down, I knew better. The next few days were strange, to say the least. It started with a call about 3 tourists who'd gone missing. They'd been walking on one of the main boardwalk trails, a place so straightforward you'd have to try to get lost, but somehow they just vanished. I was the one who found their camera. It was lying on the boardwalk right where they were last seen. I flipped through the photos, and most of them were normal, pictures of birds, trees, and the swamp. But then there were a few that made my stomach tighten. The last photos showed shapes in the mist, tall, glowing figures that looked almost human but not quite. They were blurry, like the camera couldn't focus on them properly, but you could still make out their outlines. I told myself it was just some trick of light or fog, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Later that day, I ran into one of the local fishermen at the dock. He looked shaken, which wasn't like him at all. "Bobby," he said, his voice low, "you ever seen a boat move against the current with no one aboard?" I frowned. "What are you talking about?" He told me he'd seen an empty boat drifting upriver against the flow of the water, like something invisible was pulling it along. He swore he wasn't imagining it, and I could tell by the look in his eyes that he believed every word. That night at the visitor center, something else happened that sent a chill down my spine. A group of kids had been drawing pictures during a nature talk, and when I walked by to check on them, I noticed they were all drawing the same thing, tall, glowing figures standing in misty water. I asked them where they got the idea for their drawings, but none of them had an answer. One little girl just shrugged and said, "I saw it in my head." By now I couldn't ignore what was happening. The Everglades had always been full of mysteries, stories passed down by locals about things that couldn't be explained, but this felt different. It felt closer. Things only got worse from there. Vincent started acting strange, not himself at all. One night, I caught him sleepwalking outside his cabin, heading straight for the water like he was in some kind of trance. When I called out to him, he stopped and turned around slowly, but his eyes looked blank, like he wasn't really there. Then there were the animals, or what was left of them. I found dried husks of fish and small mammals scattered along the water's edge. They weren't eaten or torn apart like you'd expect from a predator. They were completely dried out, like something had sucked all the life out of them. The final straw came when I talked to one of my old Seminole friends, a tribal elder named Joseph, who'd lived in these parts longer than anyone else I knew. When I told him about what we'd been seeing, the lights, the mist columns, the strange shapes, his face grew serious. "They're awake again," he said quietly. "Who's awake?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "The people who live in the breath of the water." I didn't know what he meant at first, but then he told me an old story about beings that lived in the mist, a kind of spirit or creature that could take on human shapes and travel through water and vapor. According to Joseph, they weren't evil exactly, but they weren't friendly either. They fed on human consciousness, on thoughts and memories, and left their victims as empty shells. "They've been sleeping for a long time," Joseph said, "but something must have disturbed them." I thought about all the recent changes in the park, the restoration projects meant to bring back natural water flow after years of mismanagement, and wondered if we'd accidentally woken something up. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the distant hum of frogs and crickets, I couldn't stop thinking about Joseph's words asterisk. The people who live in the breath of the water.
And
For the first time in years, I felt afraid. The fear I felt that night didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. The next day, Vincent didn't show up for our morning patrol. I figured maybe he'd overslept, but when I went to check on him, his cabin was empty. His bed was made, his boots were gone, and his airboat keys were missing. I spent the whole day searching for him, crisscrossing the swamp in my boat and calling his name until my throat was raw. By evening, I found his airboat drifting in a narrow channel, the engine off, and the gas tank nearly empty. Vincent wasn't on board. When I finally found him almost 24 hours later, he was lying on the ground near the water's edge, completely unresponsive. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the sky, but it was like he wasn't really there. The doctors said he was alive, his heart was beating, his brain was functioning, but he wouldn't wake up. It was as if something had taken him, or taken part of him. I couldn't stop thinking about what Joseph had said. The people in the mist feeding on consciousness. Was that what had happened to Vincent? Had they taken his mind and left his body behind? The next few days were chaos. 2 more rangers went missing after investigating reports of strange lights near one of the deeper channels. When we found their boats, they were empty too, just like Vincent's had been. I started noticing patterns in all of it. The misty shapes, the lights, the disappearances, they all seemed to happen during certain conditions, nights with a full moon and high tides. It wasn't random, there was a rhythm to it, like they were following some kind of natural cycle. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't new. I dug through old park records and found accounts of strange events going back decades, stories of people vanishing without a trace or being found in catatonic states like Vincent. One report from 1924 described an entire patrol of 6 soldiers disappearing during a training exercise in the swamp. They called it the Lost Patrol, and no one ever figured out what happened to them. I started piecing things together and realized something else. These beings, the ones Joseph had warned me about, they'd been dormant for years. Probably because of all the water management systems we'd put in place to control the flow of the Everglades. But now that we'd started restoring natural water flow as part of conservation efforts, we'd woken them up. One night, as I sat on my porch trying to make sense of it all, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The mist had rolled in thick that evening, so thick I could barely see past the edge of my island, but as I stared out at it, I noticed shapes moving within it. At first, they were just shadows, tall and thin, but then they started to take form. Human-like figures with glowing outlines stepped out of the mist and stood at the edge of the water watching me. They didn't move or make a sound, they just stood there. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward them, but as soon as the beam hit them, they dissolved into vapor and disappeared into the fog. The next morning, I went back to see Joseph. He told me there might be a way to communicate with them, not with words but through reflections and ripples in the water. He said they understood patterns better than language, and that if I could find their central location, the place where they were strongest, I might be able to reason with them. But there was a risk too. If they saw me as a threat or didn't like what I had to say, well, Joseph didn't need to spell it out for me. I spent the next few days preparing for what felt like a battle but wasn't exactly one. I gathered supplies, firewood, native herbs Joseph had given me for protection, and studied maps of the park until I thought I knew every inch by heart. Finally, when the conditions were right, a full moon and high tide, I set out into the swamp alone. I don't think I've ever been more nervous than I was that night. The moon was high and bright, casting silver light over the swamp, and the tide had risen enough to flood parts of the trails. The mist was thicker than I'd ever seen, curling around the trees and water like it had a life of its own. I followed the patterns, the ripples in the water, the way the mist moved, and let them guide me. It felt like something was pulling me toward a place I'd never been before, deep in the heart of the Everglades. After hours of navigating narrow channels and dodging fallen branches, I found an underwater limestone cave hidden beneath a cluster of ancient cypress trees. The entrance was just barely visible above the waterline, and as I stepped inside, I felt a strange stillness settle over me. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the walls of the cave seemed to hum with energy. Carvings covered every surface, pictographs showing figures that looked like the glowing shapes I'd seen in the mist. In some of the carvings, they were teaching humans, showing them how to fish and navigate the water. In others, they were surrounded by people who looked like they were praying or offering gifts. I realized these beings weren't just creatures, they were part of this land's history. They'd lived here long before us, maybe even before the Seminole or Calusa tribes. And now, after all this time, they were waking up to find their home destroyed, drained, and polluted by human hands. As I stood there staring at the carvings, I felt a presence behind me. When I turned around, they were there. The luminous ones, their glowing forms filled the cave, their outlines shifting like mist caught in a breeze. They didn't speak, but I could feel their intentions, like thoughts pressing into my mind. They weren't angry exactly, but they were desperate. They wanted to survive, to move to undamaged waters where they could exist without interference. But to do that, they needed vessels, human bodies to carry them across the swamp. I knew what they were asking for. They didn't want to hurt us. They just wanted to live. But I couldn't let them take more people. Not Vincent. Not anyone else. I remembered what Joseph had said about communicating through patterns. Slowly, carefully, I knelt by the water and began creating ripples with my hand, circles overlapping circles like a message written in waves. The luminous ones watched me closely, their forms shifting as if they were trying to understand. When I added firelight and burned the herbs Joseph had given me, their glow dimmed slightly, like they were retreating. I showed them boundaries, places where they could live undisturbed, and promised to protect those areas from development, if they agreed to leave us alone. For what felt like hours, we stared at each other in silence. Then slowly, one by one, they dissolved into mist and disappeared into the water. When I left that cave, I felt like I'd just survived something impossible, but also something important. The Park Service didn't believe my report about what happened that night. They chalked it up to exhaustion or stress and dismissed it as nonsense. But they did agree to restrict development in certain sensitive ecological areas, which was good enough for me. Vincent never woke up from his catatonic state. He passed away quietly a few months later, and we buried him near his family's home in Miami. As for me, I stayed in the Everglades for years after that night, dedicating myself to protecting its wild places, not just for us, but for them too. Now I'm an old man teaching young rangers how to read the signs, the ripples in the water, the movement of mist, and how to respect this land for what it is alive. And when my time comes, when it's my turn to leave this world, I hope they'll be there waiting for me in the mist.